years ago, I was given a book of poems by a student as a gift. And there's a line from one of them that's really stuck with me. The poem is called A Woman's Place by Denise Frohman, and the opening stanza reads as follows. I heard a woman becomes herself the first time she speaks without permission. As a history teacher, this really made me think about my favourite women from the past, all of whom definitely spoke without permission. I would imagine that some of the women I'm going to talk about today are women you may never have heard of. And why is that? Well, it's not only because these are all women, who as a group have often been marginalised from the historical narrative, but there's another intersection at play here. These women are also all women of colour. Therefore, what makes the achievements of these women all the more impressive is that they have the additional hurdle of race to navigate within their historical context. All three of the women I'm going to talk about today challenge our understanding of history. Who made history? Who shaped history? And who participated in history at full volume? I'm going to tell you a tiny sliver about all of these women, and we're going to reflect on what we can learn from them. The first woman that I'm going to be talking to you about is Sapphire Dileep Singh. Now, Sapphire was born in 1876. She was the youngest daughter of the exiled Maharaja Dileep Singh of India. Sapphire was a suffragette, and she was a suffragette in more ways than one. In 1911, for example, she boycotted the census, writing, "No vote, no census. As women do not count, they refuse to be counted. I have a conscientious objection to filling in this form." She slammed a suffragette banner on the Prime Minister's car. She defiantly sold the suffragette newspaper outside Hampton Court Palace of all places, a particularly sensational act because her godmother was Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria was staunchly against women's suffrage. Sapphire spoke regularly at her local suffragette meetings. She addressed large audiences confidently, and she also chaired meetings. She contributed significantly financially to the suffragette movement, did so far beyond the average amount. She resisted paying her taxes several times through her work with the Women's Tax Resistance League. She was taken to court for this many times as well. Sapphire wasn't just involved in the suffrage movement, she was involved in other issues that were close to her heart. For example, she brought great and necessary attention to the contribution that Indian soldiers were making during the First World War. So what can we learn from Sapphire? First of all, we can't skirt around another intersection that she is privy to. She was a woman, she was of Asian origin, but she was somebody who enjoyed a life of financial privilege. So in terms of class, we have to acknowledge that. But the lesson that we can take away is that simply this, I suppose, is be aware of your privilege. I feel like Sapphire was, and I think that's reflected in her financial contributions, for example, and the way that a lot of the work that she did was related to taxes. She also completely disrupts our understanding about the suffragettes. She shows us that there was a woman of colour that wasn't just part of this movement, but someone who played a really significant and central role, you could argue, in leading the campaign for women's suffrage in Britain. So next time you think about the suffragettes and you imagine a sea of women in hats in purple, white and green sashes, remember that there was a prominent brown face within that crowd, and her name was Sapphire Dileep Singh. The second woman I'm going to talk to you about is Olive Morris. Now, Olive Morris was part of the British Black Panther movement in the late 1960s. At the age of 17, she intervened when the police falsely accused a Nigerian diplomat of stealing his own car. She was taken into police custody and she was absolutely not treated appropriately. But this did not deter Olive at all. She was central to amplifying the voices of the most vulnerable. So, for example, she supported the squatters campaign in the early 1970s. There is an iconic image of Olive climbing on the roof of a building she was occupying whilst the police were trying to evict her. The struggle for black women was at the heart of her activism. She was the co-founder of the Brixton Black Women's Group in 1974. She also helped to found OAD, the Organisation of Women of Asian and African Descent. Now, their aim was, quote, to show people sisterhood in action. And if we think back to that poem about speaking without permission, this gave those women permission to speak and share and learn from each other. It provided a unique opportunity for Black and Asian women to meet with each other and converse And the first conference that was held had a panel of speakers that talked on a variety of different issues: education, employment, immigration, the health service. And so many of the Black and Asian women who attended those initial meetings set up their own local groups. So what that shows is that when they, as soon as they kind of had a taste of that permission, they ran with it. Organisations popped up all over the country. So OAD at that point acted as an umbrella group. And they really supported women in finding their own voice. So Olive clearly was a shining light. She amplified the voices of those who needed it the most. And the lesson that we can learn from Olive is absolutely do not wait. And I say that because what I haven't mentioned is that she achieved all that she did and unfortunately died at the age of 27. She had cancer. And so I'll reiterate again, do not wait. Olive Morris didn't. She didn't wait for permission to speak. She did, and she amplified the voices of others. And we can learn so much from her in the short time that she was with us. The final woman I'm going to talk about, I'm going to open with a quote from her. She says, "What you're running here is not a factory, it is a zoo. I've had enough, I want my freedom." So spoke Jaya Desai in August 1976. And with that, she walked out of her job as a film processor at the Grunwitt Laboratory and started a strike. 100 women went on strike with her. They were protesting for a variety of reasons: overtime agreements, pay inequality, racist company practices. And largely thanks to her leadership, by July 1977, there were 20,000 people joining this initial small group of strikers on the streets of Willesden, northwest London. There was significant police presence, of course, because of the numbers of people that were supporting them. And the strike went on for a couple of years. There were violent clashes between the police and protesters. There were arrests, there were injuries. Jaya Desai actually used a suffragette tactic and went on hunger strike. Lots of other, groups of workers wanted to demonstrate their solidarity with her. So, for example, the Union of Postal Workers, they refused to send and pick up posts from the factory because they wanted to show, that they supported the strike. What Jaya teaches us is definitely the importance of perseverance. She had the courage to speak out, even when she didn't necessarily see immediate results. She carried on anyway. And the Grunwick strike, it may not have succeeded in immediately improving working conditions and, gaining the right to unionise, for example. But what it did do and what she did is she highlighted the plight of working class ethnic minority communities in the workplace in the 70s. She also proved something else. She proved that whilst her sari, her cardigan, and her tiny stature may not look particularly intimidating, she proved that didn't matter. You could be a force of nature however you dressed and however you looked. And that's why I will always fondly think of her as the striker in the sari. So why does this matter to me? So it matters to me because I certainly have only come across these women in my adult life. Yet these women were present in such familiar historical contexts that we cover in our history education at school. The suffragettes, protest movements, modern industrial strikes. But so much of my understanding of history as a student certainly didn't include any women like this. And if I really reflect on my time in school, personally for me, I think maybe the only time I came across anyone who looked like me in the school curriculum was possibly in the context of forced marriages, which we can all agree is pretty problematic. But I also think there's something far bigger at play here. And for that, we need to think about the cliche sentiment that we always hear when we think about history that sadly, rings true. History has been written by the victors. Now, we can't rectify how history has been written about or who history has historically chosen to remember, commemorate, immortalise. What we can do collectively is challenge who we choose to remember now, moving forward. And not instead of anyone else, but in addition to. I think what's also key here is not to tokenise the women that I've spoken about, relegating them, to only being rolled out on International Women's Day or Black History Month. Instead, let's celebrate these previously marginalised voices within the historical context that they lived in. So to see Sapphire, for example, as someone who was just as important as those suffragettes we all know, like Emmeline Pankhurst and Emily Davison, to see Olive Morris as a key player in the British civil rights movement that so often gets far less airtime than its American counterpart, to see Jerben and the Grunwick strike as a key event when we think about post-Windrush immigration. I strongly believe that there's room for everyone, not only in the history classroom, but also on the bookshelves of history.